The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pentagon as General Robert Hayes straightened his tie one last time. At 58 years old, he had earned every one of those 4 stars on his uniform through blood, sweat, and countless sleepless nights protecting American interests around the world. Today marked a special milestone in his distinguished career. He was heading to London for one of the most important NATO summits in decades. Hayes had served in the military for 34 years, starting as a fresh-faced lieutenant straight out of West Point. He remembered those early days when he would salute senior officers with nervous energy, hoping he wouldn't make any mistakes. Now, decades later, he was the one receiving those salutes. His chest bore witness to his journey, ribbons and medals that told stories of courage under fire, leadership in impossible situations, and dedication that never wavered. The general's reputation preceded him wherever he went. Fellow officers spoke of him with a mixture of respect and awe. He had led troops through 3 major conflicts, each time bringing more soldiers home safely than anyone thought possible. His strategic mind was legendary in military circles, and his ability to make tough decisions under pressure had saved countless lives over the years. As his aide knocked on the office door, Hayes took one final look at the wall behind his desk. Framed photographs showed him with presidents, foreign dignitaries, and soldiers from around the world. But the picture he treasured most was a simple snapshot of him with his unit after their first successful mission together. Those young faces reminded him why he had dedicated his life to service. "Sir, the car is ready," his aide announced. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson had been with Hayes for 3 years and knew the general's routines better than anyone. Thompson was efficient, respectful, and understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between success and failure in their line of work. Hayes nodded and gathered his briefing materials. The NATO summit would bring together military leaders from 29 countries, each dealing with their own unique challenges and perspectives. As one of America's most senior military officials, Hayes would play a crucial role in shaping decisions that could affect global security for years to come. The drive to Andrews Air Force Base gave Hayes time to review his notes. The agenda was packed with critical discussions about emerging threats, resource allocation, and coordinated defense strategies. He had spent weeks preparing for these meetings, consulting with experts and reviewing intelligence reports that painted a complex picture of the current global situation. During the flight across the Atlantic, Hayes found himself thinking about the differences between American and European military traditions. He had worked with NATO allies many times before, but this would be his first extended visit to London. His previous interactions with British forces had always been professional and productive, though he had noticed they sometimes approached things differently than their American counterparts. The general's philosophy had always been straightforward. Respect was earned through competence and dedication, regardless of nationality or background. He had seen brave soldiers from dozens of countries, each bringing their own strengths to joint operations. However, he also believed that rank and experience should be recognized universally among military personnel. As the plane descended toward London, Hayes reviewed the cultural briefing his staff had prepared. British military protocol had its own unique characteristics, shaped by centuries of tradition and ceremony. The document mentioned various customs and expectations, but Hayes found himself skimming through most of it. After all, he reasoned, military professionalism was universal, and his rank should speak for itself. The landing was smooth, and Hayes felt energized despite the long flight. London's skyline stretched out before them, a blend of ancient architecture and modern buildings that reflected the city's rich history. He had visited England once before, many years ago as a young officer, but that trip had been brief and focused entirely on training exercises. His British liaison officer, Major Williams, met them at the airport with typical British politeness and efficiency. Williams had served in Afghanistan alongside American forces and understood how to work with different military cultures. During the drive into the city, he provided Hayes with updates on the summit preparations and a quick overview of the scheduled events. "General, I should mention that tomorrow's ceremonial visit to Buckingham Palace follows very specific protocols," Williams said diplomatically. "The Queen's Guards maintain centuries-old traditions that apply to everyone, regardless of rank or nationality. Hayes nodded absently, his attention focused on the bustling London streets outside the window. He had attended hundreds of ceremonial events throughout his career, from Pentagon ceremonies to international state functions. The basic principles were always the same: show up on time, follow the lead of the host nation, and represent your country with dignity. The hotel where they were staying had been chosen specifically for visiting dignitaries. Hayes's suite overlooked Hyde Park, and from his window, he could see the early evening joggers and dog walkers enjoying the green space. It reminded him of his own daily runs around Arlington, a routine that helped him stay physically and mentally sharp. That evening, Hayes attended a welcome reception with other NATO officials. The conversation flowed easily between topics ranging from family updates to strategic challenges facing their respective nations. He found himself particularly enjoying a discussion with a German general about innovative training techniques they had both implemented with great success. As the evening wound down, Hayes felt confident about the days ahead. His extensive experience, combined with his reputation for straight talk and practical solutions, would serve him well in the upcoming meetings. He had handled far more challenging situations than a few days of diplomatic discussions in London. Back in his room, Hayes laid out his dress uniform for the next day's palace visit. The fabric was perfectly pressed, each medal and ribbon positioned, exactly according to regulations. His 4 stars gleamed under the room's lighting, symbols of the trust placed in him by his country and his peers. He spent some time reviewing his notes one more time before bed. The NATO summit agenda included several items where American leadership would be crucial. Hayes felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with his position, but it was a weight he had learned to carry with confidence and purpose. Before turning out the lights, Hayes called his wife back in Virginia. She had supported him through every promotion and deployment, understanding that his service came with both privileges and sacrifices. They talked briefly about the children's activities and upcoming family events, normal conversations that kept him grounded despite the extraordinary nature of his professional responsibilities. As he drifted off to sleep, Hayes thought about the next day's schedule. The palace visit was purely ceremonial, a brief stop before the serious work of the summit began. He had met with royalty before and understood the importance of representing his country appropriately in such settings. What Hayes couldn't have known as he fell asleep was that tomorrow would bring an encounter that would fundamentally change his perspective on leadership, respect, and the true meaning of military discipline. The lessons he thought he had mastered over 3 decades of service were about to be challenged in ways he never could have imagined. The alarm clock's gentle buzz woke him at 600 hours, just as it had for thousands of mornings throughout his career. General Hayes began his day with the same routine that had served him well through deployments, crises, and peacetime assignments. Little did he know that by sunset, his understanding of military protocol and personal humility would be forever transformed by a young soldier standing guard at one of the world's most famous palaces. The morning of the palace visit dawned crisp and clear, with that particular London light that photographers love. General Hayes had been up since dawn, running through Hyde Park and reviewing his schedule over coffee and the morning briefings. His dress uniform hung perfectly pressed in the wardrobe, every detail precisely arranged according to military regulations that he could recite in his sleep. By 9:30, Hayes was ready to leave the hotel. His aide, Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, had coordinated with their British escort to ensure everything would run smoothly. The drive to Buckingham Palace would take about 15 minutes, giving them plenty of time to arrive before the scheduled 10:15 meeting with palace officials. As their black sedan wound through London's busy streets, Hayes found himself impressed by the city's energy. Business people hurried along sidewalks, tourists clustered around landmarks with cameras, and the famous red double-decker buses navigated through traffic with practiced ease. It reminded him why London had remained such an important ally. The determination and resilience of its people showed in everything from their architecture to their daily routines. "Sir, we'll be approaching the palace from the mall," Major Williams explained from the front passenger seat. "The main gates are quite impressive, and there's usually a crowd of tourists taking photographs. The Queen's Guards maintain their posts regardless of what's happening around them." Hayes nodded, checking his watch. Military punctuality was something he valued highly, and being late to any appointment, especially one involving international relations, was simply unacceptable. He had built his reputation partly on reliability, and today would be no different. As they turned onto the mall, the palace came into view, and Hayes had to admit it was quite a sight. The building itself spoke of centuries of history and tradition, its stone facade weathered by time but still imposing. Tourists lined the black iron railings, many with cameras pointed toward the famous red-coated guards who stood motionless at their posts. "Those are the Queen's Guards," Williams noted, following Hayes's gaze. "They're selected from some of Britain's finest regiments. The position requires exceptional discipline and dedication." Hayes studied the guards as their car slowed in traffic. Even from a distance, he could see their perfect posture and absolute stillness. It reminded him of the honor guards at Arlington National Cemetery, soldiers who understood that their role was about more than just standing at attention. Their vehicle pulled up to the palace gates at exactly 10:05, giving them a comfortable 10-minute buffer before the scheduled appointment. Hayes stepped out of the car, automatically adjusting his uniform jacket and ensuring his ribbons were perfectly aligned. The morning sun caught the 4 stars on his shoulders, and he felt that familiar sense of pride that came with representing his country abroad. Thompson gathered the necessary paperwork while Hayes approached the main gate. A small crowd of tourists had gathered nearby, some pointing excitedly at the approaching American general. Hayes was accustomed to such attention and maintained his professional bearing as he walked toward the guard post. The Queen's Guard on duty was a young man, probably in his early 20s, Hayes estimated. His red tunic was immaculate, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned, and his expression remained completely neutral as the American delegation approached. The guard's rifle was held in the traditional position, and he stood with the kind of motionless discipline that spoke of extensive training and absolute dedication to duty. Hayes expected the usual military courtesies as he approached. Throughout his career, guard posts had always recognized his rank immediately, either through verbal acknowledgement or appropriate gestures of respect. His 4 stars and extensive ribbon rack made his status unmistakable, and he had grown accustomed to the deference that came with his position. "Good morning," Hayes said confidently as he reached the gate. "General Robert Hayes, United States Army, here for the 10:15 appointment with palace officials." The guard's eyes moved to meet Hayes's gaze, but his expression remained completely neutral. "Good morning, sir. May I see your identification and authorization documents, please?" Hayes paused for a moment, surprised by the formal request. While he understood the need for security, he had expected his uniform and obvious status to expedite the process. "Of course," he replied, reaching for his military identification card. Thompson stepped forward with a folder containing their diplomatic credentials and the official invitation to the palace meeting. The guard examined each document carefully, taking more time than Hayes thought necessary for what should have been a routine verification process. "Sir, I'll need to call for verification of these credentials," the guard said politely but firmly. Hayes felt his patience beginning to thin. "Son, I'm a 4-star general in the United States Army, here on official NATO business. These credentials have been verified multiple times already." The guard maintained his professional composure despite Hayes's increasingly sharp tone. "I understand, sir, but palace protocol requires that all visitors, regardless of rank or status, follow the same verification procedures." The word "regardless" hit Hayes like a slap. In his world, rank absolutely mattered. It represented years of sacrifice, proven leadership, and the trust of an entire nation. The idea that some palace protocol could treat him the same as any tourist felt like a personal insult. "Young man, do you understand who you're speaking to?" Hayes's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "I've been personally invited by your government, and I don't have time for bureaucratic delays." The crowd of tourists had grown larger, many of them now openly watching the exchange with curious expressions. Cameras and phones were being raised as people sensed that something unusual was happening at the normally routine palace gates. The Queen's Guard never moved from his position, never raised his voice, and never showed any sign of being intimidated. by Hayes's rank or demeanor. "Sir, I appreciate your position, but I must follow palace security protocols without exception. No one enters without proper verification, regardless of their status or rank." Hayes felt his face beginning to flush. The young guard's calm professionalism somehow made the situation even more frustrating. He was being treated like any ordinary visitor, and the implications of that treatment were not lost on him. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Hayes said, his voice rising slightly. "I demand to speak with your commanding officer immediately." "My commanding officer will be contacted as part of the verification process, sir," the guard replied evenly. "Until then, I must ask you to wait here." The word "wait" was the final straw for Hayes. Throughout his entire career, people waited for him, not the other way around. Conference rooms fell silent when he entered. Junior officers jumped to attention at his approach, and foreign dignitaries made time in their schedules to accommodate his availability. Without thinking clearly, Hayes stepped forward toward the gate, intending to simply walk past the guard and sort things out with palace officials directly. "I'm not waiting for anything, son. I'm going inside now." What happened next would be replayed in Hayes's mind for years to come. The Queen's Guard, moving with fluid precision that spoke of countless hours of training, stepped directly into Hayes's path while simultaneously bringing his rifle across his chest in a blocking position. "Sir, I cannot allow you to pass without proper authorization," the guard said, his voice still calm but now carrying an unmistakable note of finality. Hayes found himself standing face to face with a soldier who couldn't have been more than 25 years old, completely blocked from entering the palace grounds. The guard's eyes met his steadily, showing no fear, no deference, and no willingness to compromise on his duties. The crowd of tourists had grown silent, sensing the tension of the moment. Cameras captured every second of the standoff between the American general and the British Guard. Hayes realized that he was in a position he had never experienced before in his adult life. His authority had been completely neutralized by a young soldier following orders. For several long seconds, the two men stood facing each other, representing different military traditions but sharing an absolute commitment to duty. Neither was willing to back down, but only one of them had the legal authority to control access to the palace grounds. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the tension as additional palace security personnel arrived to assess the situation. The next few minutes unfolded like a slow-motion scene from a movie that General Hayes never imagined he would star in. As additional palace security personnel arrived, the situation that had started as a simple misunderstanding began to escalate into something far more serious and embarrassing than anything Hayes had experienced in his decorated career. A senior palace security officer approached the scene, his practiced eye immediately assessing the situation. The crowd of tourists had grown considerably, with some people openly filming the confrontation on their phones. Hayes could hear whispered conversations in multiple languages as people tried to understand what was happening at the normally serene palace gates. "Good morning, General Hayes," the security officer said professionally. "I'm Chief Inspector Williams with Palace Security. I understand there's been some confusion about the verification process." Hayes felt a moment of relief, assuming that someone with authority had finally arrived to resolve the situation quickly. "Inspector Williams, thank you. There seems to be some misunderstanding. I'm here for a scheduled appointment, and this guard is preventing me from entering despite my obvious credentials." Chief Inspector Williams nodded diplomatically. "I understand your frustration, sir. However, the guard was following correct protocol. Palace security procedures apply to all visitors without exception, including heads of state and senior military officials." The word "without exception" hit Hayes again, harder this time because it came from someone clearly in authority. He looked around at the growing crowd, many of whom were now openly pointing and taking photographs. The situation was spiraling beyond his control in ways he had never experienced. "Inspector, surely you can see that this is unnecessarily bureaucratic," Hayes said, trying to maintain his composure while his frustration mounted. "I'm a 4-star general representing the United States military at a NATO summit. This delay is inappropriate and frankly insulting." The Queen's Guard had remained perfectly still throughout the exchange, his rifle still held in the blocking position. His young face showed no emotion, No satisfaction at having stopped a senior officer, and no fear of the consequences. He was simply doing his job exactly as he had been trained to do it. Chief Inspector Williams pulled out his radio and began speaking quietly into it, clearly initiating the verification process that should have been routine but was now taking place under the intense scrutiny of dozens of tourists and their cameras. Hayes realized with growing horror that this incident was being documented by people from around the world. "Sir, the verification process will take approximately 15 to 20 minutes, Williams informed Hayes. "I'll need you to wait here while we confirm your credentials through the proper channels." Hayes felt his world tilt on its axis. For the first time in decades, someone was telling him to wait instead of asking when would be convenient for him. The psychological impact was staggering. He had grown so accustomed to his authority being recognized instantly that this basic challenge to his status felt like a personal attack. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Hayes said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I have meetings to attend, responsibilities to fulfill. I cannot simply stand here like some tourist waiting for bureaucratic approval." But even as he spoke, Hayes realized that was exactly what was happening. Despite his uniform, his ribbons, his 4 stars, and 3 decades of distinguished service, he was being treated exactly like any other visitor who had arrived without proper documentation. The recognition stung deeply. Major Williams, his British liaison, approached cautiously. He had been observing from a respectful distance, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unsure how to intervene without making matters worse. "General, perhaps I can assist with expediting the verification process," he offered diplomatically. Hayes looked at Williams with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. Here was a British officer, significantly junior in rank, offering to help resolve a situation that Hayes should have been able to handle himself. The role reversal was humiliating in ways that Hayes was only beginning to understand. Meanwhile, the Queen's Guard continued his duty exactly as before. He hadn't moved from his position, hadn't shown any reaction to Hayes's increasing agitation, and hadn't wavered in his commitment to following orders precisely as given. His discipline was absolute, and Hayes found himself reluctantly impressed, despite his anger. The crowd continued to grow, and Hayes began to notice news crews arriving. Someone had apparently alerted local media about the unusual confrontation at the palace gates. The last thing Hayes needed was for this incident to become an international news story, but that possibility was becoming more likely with each passing minute. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson approached his general with obvious concern. "Sir, perhaps we should consider rescheduling the palace visit for later today, after the documentation issues are resolved through diplomatic channels." The suggestion made practical sense, but Hayes's pride rebelled against the idea of retreating from this confrontation. He had never backed down from a challenge in his military career, and the thought of being forced to withdraw by a young guard felt like admitting defeat. "I'm not rescheduling anything," Hayes said firmly. "I'm here for a legitimate appointment, and I'm not leaving until this ridiculous situation is resolved." As if to emphasize his point, Hayes took another step toward the gate, still believing that his authority would eventually prevail. The Queen's Guard responded immediately, maintaining his blocking position with the same calm professionalism he had shown throughout the encounter. "Sir, I must ask you to step back," the guard said, his voice still respectful but carrying an unmistakable note of warning. Hayes realized with shock that the young soldier was prepared to physically prevent him from entering the palace grounds. The idea that someone barely older than his own son would stand in his way seemed impossible, yet it was happening right in front of dozens of witnesses. Chief Inspector Williams stepped between them, his diplomatic skills now focused on preventing the situation from escalating further. "General Hayes, I understand your frustration, but I must ask for your cooperation while we complete the verification process. Any attempt to bypass security protocols will result in additional complications that neither of us wants." The word complications carried an implicit threat that Hayes couldn't ignore. He was in a foreign country, representing the United States military, and any serious incident could have diplomatic ramifications far beyond his personal embarrassment. For the first time since arriving at the palace, Hayes truly looked around at his situation. Tourists were recording everything on their phones, News cameras were capturing his every expression, and palace security personnel were treating him like any other visitor who had become difficult about following procedures. The psychological impact hit him like a physical blow. This young guard, following orders with perfect discipline, had effectively neutralized all of Hayes's authority, experience, and status. Not through disrespect or insubordination, but through simple, unwavering adherence to duty. Hayes found himself studying the guard's face more carefully. Despite the formal uniform and rigid posture, he could see that this was just a young man, probably someone's son, who had committed himself to serving his country with absolute dedication. The parallels to his own early military service were impossible to ignore. As the minutes ticked by, Hayes realized that he was witnessing something he had rarely encountered in his senior positions. Military discipline in its purest form, uncompromised by politics, rank, or convenience. This guard wasn't following orders because Hayes was unimportant. He was following orders because the orders themselves were important. The crowd continued to watch, and Hayes became increasingly aware that his reaction to this situation would define not just his own reputation, but potentially affect relationships between American and British military forces. Every choice he made in the next few minutes would have consequences far beyond his personal pride. Standing outside the palace gates, waiting for verification like any other visitor, General Hayes experienced something he hadn't felt in decades. Complete vulnerability and the humbling recognition that authority meant nothing without the proper foundation to support it. The verification process took exactly 18 minutes, though it felt like hours to General Hayes. When Chief Inspector Williams finally approached with confirmation that all credentials were authentic and the appointment could proceed, Hayes expected to feel vindicated. Instead, he felt something entirely different, a profound sense of reflection that surprised him more than the initial confrontation had. As the palace gates opened, and Hayes was finally granted entry, he turned back to look at the Queen's Guard who had stood his ground so firmly. The young soldier had returned to his original position, standing at perfect attention as if nothing unusual had happened. His discipline was so complete that the entire incident might have been just another routine part of his day. The palace. Meeting proceeded as scheduled, with Hayes participating in discussions about NATO coordination and joint military exercises. But throughout the formal conversations, his mind kept returning to those 18 minutes outside the gates. He had experienced something rare in his senior career, a complete challenge to his authority that had nothing to do with politics or personality conflicts. That evening, back at his hotel, Hayes found himself unable to focus on the briefing materials for the next day's summit sessions. He kept thinking about the young guard's face, the absolute commitment to duty he had witnessed, and his own reaction to being treated like any other visitor rather than a distinguished military leader. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson knocked on the door with the daily schedule updates. "Sir, tomorrow's sessions begin at 0800 hours. The British delegation has confirmed that yesterday's incident at the palace will have no impact on the NATO proceedings." Hayes looked up from his papers. "Thompson, what did you think about what happened today?" Thompson paused, clearly unsure how to respond honestly without overstepping boundaries. "Sir, it was educational to observe different military traditions in action." "Educational?" Hayes repeated thoughtfully. "That's one way to put it." After Thompson left, Hayes found himself reviewing the incident from multiple angles. His initial anger had faded, replaced by something more complex and unexpected. He began to see the confrontation not as a personal insult, but as a demonstration of military excellence that transcended national boundaries. The more he thought about it, the more impressed he became with the guard's performance. Here was a young soldier who had faced down a four-star general without wavering, not out of disrespect but out of absolute commitment to his duties. How many soldiers would have been intimidated by Hayes's rank and bent the rules to avoid confrontation? Hayes realized that he had witnessed something remarkable: military discipline in its purest form, uncompromised by rank, politics, or convenience. The guard had treated him exactly as protocol required, without fear or favoritism. In many ways, It was the kind of unwavering commitment to duty that Hayes had spent his career trying to instill in his own troops. By the next morning, Hayes had made a decision that would surprise everyone who knew him. Instead of heading directly to the NATO summit, he asked his driver to make a detour past Buckingham Palace. He wanted to see the Queen's Guards again, but this time with a completely different perspective. As their car approached the palace, Hayes could see the familiar red uniforms standing at their posts. The same disciplined attention, the same unwavering commitment to duty that had so frustrated him the day before now, struck him as admirable. These guards represented something timeless about military service that transcended individual personalities or career ambitions. "Sir, did you want to stop?" his driver asked as they passed the main gates. "No," Hayes replied. "Just wanted to see them again." But as the day progressed through various NATO meetings and discussions, Hayes found himself thinking more and more about returning to the palace. Not for any official business, but for something more personal. He had behaved poorly the previous day, allowing his ego and impatience to override his better judgment. That evening, against the advice of his security detail and his aide, Hayes made an unprecedented decision. He changed out of his dress uniform into civilian clothes and took a taxi back to Buckingham Palace. He didn't want the formality of his rank to influence what he needed to do. The same guard was on duty, standing at exactly the same position, with exactly the same perfect posture. Hayes approached the gate, but this time as a private citizen, rather than a demanding general. The difference in his own mindset was striking. "Excuse me," Hayes said quietly to the guard. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" The guard's eyes moved to meet Hayes's, and there was a flicker of recognition. "Sir, I'm on duty and cannot engage in conversation while at my post." Hayes nodded, understanding the protocol now in a way he hadn't the day before. "I understand. Could you tell me when your shift ends? I'd like to speak with you privately if possible." The guard maintained his professional composure, but Hayes could see curiosity in his eyes. "My relief arrives at 2000 hours, sir. Would you be willing to meet me briefly after that? There's something I need to say to you." After a moment's consideration, the guard gave a slight nod. "The Red Lion Pub, 2 blocks east of here, sir." At exactly 8:15 that evening, Hayes sat in a corner booth of the Red Lion, still wearing civilian clothes and feeling more nervous than he had before any military briefing in recent memory. When the young guard entered the pub, now dressed in casual clothes, he looked even younger than Hayes had realized. The guard approached the table cautiously. "General Hayes, I'm David Collins." Hayes stood and extended his hand. "Please just call me Robert, and thank you for agreeing to meet with me." As they sat down, Hayes found himself looking at Collins with completely different eyes. This wasn't the formal, uniformed representative of British military tradition he had confronted the day before. This was just a young man, probably not much older than 23 or 24, who had somehow managed to outclass a 4-star general through simple adherence to his duties. "David, I owe you an apology," Hayes began. "Yesterday I behaved badly. I allowed my ego and impatience to override my better judgment, and I put you in an unfair position." Collins looked genuinely surprised. "Sir, I mean, Robert, you don't owe me anything. I was just doing my job." "That's exactly the point," Hayes said. "You were doing your job perfectly, and I tried to pressure you into compromising your duties because I felt my rank should exempt me from following the same rules as everyone else." They talked for over an hour, and Hayes found himself fascinated by Collins's perspective on military service. The young guard spoke about his training, his commitment to the traditions of his regiment, and his understanding that being a Queen's Guard meant upholding standards without exception. "When I joined the Guards, my sergeant major told us something I'll never forget," Collins said. "He said that we're not just protecting buildings or people, we're protecting the idea that some things are more important than individual convenience or comfort." Hayes felt those words hit him with unexpected force. Throughout his career, he had commanded respect through his achievements and authority. But this young soldier had earned respect through his willingness to uphold principles even when facing pressure from someone vastly superior in rank. As the evening continued, Hayes realized that he had learned more about leadership in one day than he had in years of senior-level meetings and strategic planning sessions. True leadership wasn't about having others recognize your authority. It was about recognizing and respecting the authority of duty itself. When they finally parted, ways outside the pub, Hayes felt transformed in ways he was still trying to understand. He had come to London expecting to share his expertise with NATO allies. Instead, he had received an education from a young guard about the fundamental principles that should guide all military service. The next morning, Hayes woke up with a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He knew exactly what he needed to do, and it had nothing to do with the NATO summit or his official duties. It had to do with acknowledging publicly what he had learned privately about leadership, respect, and the true meaning of military excellence. The morning after his conversation with David Collins, General Hayes woke up with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with NATO meetings or military strategy sessions. He had spent most of the night thinking about their discussion and had come to a decision that would surprise everyone who knew him. What had started as a personal embarrassment was about to become something much more significant. Hayes called Lieutenant Colonel Thompson early that morning with unusual instructions. Instead of heading directly to the NATO summit, he wanted to arrange a meeting with the commanding officer of the Queen's Guards Regiment. Thompson, still puzzled by the previous day's events, began making the necessary calls without asking questions. By 10 o'clock that morning, Hayes found himself sitting across from Colonel James Morrison, the commanding officer responsible for the Queen's Guards. Morrison was a career military officer with 28 years of service, and he had clearly been briefed about the incident at the palace gates. "General Hayes, I understand there was some confusion during your palace visit," Morrison began, diplomatically. Hayes held up his hand. "Colonel Morrison, there was no confusion. Your guard performed his duties exactly as he should have, and I behaved inappropriately. I'm here because I want to do something about that publicly." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. In his experience, senior officers rarely admitted fault, especially in situations involving international relations. Hayes continued, "I want to arrange a public ceremony where I can formally acknowledge Guard Collins's exemplary performance and issue a public apology for my behavior. I think both of our militaries could benefit from that kind of example." What followed was one of the most unusual conversations in Morrison's career. Here was a four-star American general, someone with more authority and prestige than Morrison could ever hope to achieve, asking for permission to publicly praise a young guard who had essentially embarrassed him in front of tourists and media. "Sir, I have to ask, why is this so important to you?" Morrison said. Hayes thought for a moment before answering. "Colonel, I've spent 34 years in the military and I thought I understood what military excellence looked like. But your guard showed me something I had lost sight of. That true discipline means following orders even when it's difficult, even when someone with more rank is pressuring you to compromise." The ceremony was arranged for the following day, during the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. Word spread quickly through military channels and media outlets that an American four-star general was planning some kind of public statement about the previous incident. Hayes spent that evening preparing remarks that would be both personal and professional. He wasn't just representing himself. He was representing American military values and the relationship between two allied nations. The weight of that responsibility felt different now than it had a few days earlier. When the ceremony began the next morning, a larger crowd than usual had gathered at the palace gates. News crews from several countries were present, and Hayes could see senior officers from both American and British forces in attendance. The attention made him nervous, but he knew this was important. As the changing of the guard concluded, Hayes stepped forward in his full dress uniform. This time his ribbons and stars felt less like symbols of personal achievement and more like representations of the values he was supposed to embody. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. 3 days ago, I had an encounter at these gates that taught me more about military excellence than any training course or command experience ever has." He went on to describe the incident from his perspective, taking full responsibility for his behavior and praising Collins' unwavering commitment to duty. The crowd listened in absolute silence as this senior American general publicly acknowledged his mistakes and praised a young British soldier. Guard Collins represented the very best of military tradition, Hayes continued. He followed his orders, exactly as given, without compromise, without fear, and without respect for rank when rank conflicted with duty. That's the kind of soldier I hope to be, even after 34 years of service. When Hayes called Collins forward and presented him with a commemorative coin from his personal collection, the young guard's composure finally cracked slightly. Hayes could see tears in his eyes as he accepted the recognition. But the ceremony was just the beginning of something much larger. Within weeks, the story had spread throughout military circles in both countries. Military academies began using the incident as a case study in leadership and military discipline. The video of Hayes's public apology became required viewing in several officer training programs. More importantly, Hayes found that the incident had fundamentally changed his approach to leadership. When he returned to the Pentagon, he began implementing changes in how senior officers interacted with junior personnel. He started a program where generals and colonels would spend time observing basic training exercises, not to evaluate, but to learn from the instructors who worked with new soldiers every day. The relationship between Hayes and Collins continued as well. They began corresponding regularly, and Hayes arranged for Collins to visit the United States as part of a military exchange program. During that visit, Collins spoke to American soldiers about the importance of maintaining standards even under pressure. Hayes also established a formal exchange program between American and British military units, focusing specifically on learning different approaches to military discipline and tradition. Officers from both countries began spending time with their counterparts, sharing techniques and perspectives that strengthened both militaries. The impact reached the highest levels of both governments. When Hayes met with the Queen 6 months later at a state dinner, she mentioned the incident specifically. "General Hayes, I understand you learned something important from one of my guards. Your Majesty, he taught me that true military excellence isn't about the authority you hold, but about how faithfully you execute the responsibilities you've been given." The Queen smiled. "That's exactly what he should have taught you." Collins, meanwhile, was promoted ahead of schedule and eventually became an instructor in the Guard training program. His story became part of the curriculum, teaching new guards that their duties were important enough to uphold even when facing pressure from senior officials. Years later, when Hayes retired from active duty, Collins was among the international officers who attended his retirement ceremony. In his farewell speech, Hayes credited the young British Guard with teaching him the most important lesson of his military career. True leadership, Hayes told the assembled officers, isn't about making others follow your authority. It's about following the higher authority of duty, principle, and service, regardless of who's watching or what pressures you face. The incident that could have been a diplomatic embarrassment had become a powerful example of how humility, respect, and commitment to duty could strengthen relationships between allies. Military officers from both countries continued to reference the story for years afterward, using it to illustrate the importance of maintaining standards and the power of acknowledging mistakes. Collins eventually rose to the rank of major and served as a military attaché in Washington, D.C., where he and Hayes maintained their friendship. They would often meet for dinner when their schedules allowed, two soldiers from different countries who had learned something important about service from each other. The lasting impact of those 18 minutes outside Buckingham Palace rippled through both militaries for years to come. It demonstrated that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected sources, and that true military excellence has nothing to do with rank and everything to do with character. Hayes's career continued successfully until his retirement, but he always credited that moment of humility at the palace gates as the turning point that made him a better leader. And Collins continued his service with the quiet pride of someone who had stood for principle when it mattered most, never knowing that 18 minutes of doing his job correctly would change the life of a 4-star general and strengthen the bonds between two allied nations.